by 2030, 70% of the skills that we need to do our job is going to have changed. We are the last generation who would have ever experienced being solely the managers of people. When we think about our strategy for 2026, I wanted to look at the trusted sources, Gartner, LinkedIn, Salesforce, HubSpot, but I also wanted to go left of field. What are most people not prepared to do? There's an opportunity to go where others won't. We're going to be deep diving into 10 emerging trends that are going to be shaping 2026.
Welcome to the REV UP Rebellion, the podcast for revenue leaders rewriting the rules of growth. I'm your host, Abbie White.
Thank you for joining me for our Lunch and Learn, where we're going to be deep diving into 10 emerging trends that are going to be shaping 2026. So if we have not met, my name is Abbie and I'm going to be running the session today. My bag really is all things sales, go-to-market and growth. That is what I am doing all day, every day, very much getting my hands dirty in the trenches, working with businesses in that manner. So when I'm approaching the topic today of the 10 emerging trends, I'm really coming from that place of sales, go-to-market and growth. And as context for you, I get to work across all different businesses. I have the best job in the world because I get to be really, really nosy and I get to go behind the scenes of the businesses. And it's a bit like when someone turns up at your house and they see all the dirty laundry and they say the good and the bad. That's kind of what I feel like I do for a job. Trade secrets will always be trade secrets and they will stay firmly behind closed doors. But what I can do for you today is from across all the businesses I'm working with, I can actually share the common themes of what I'm seeing on opportunities and also challenges and bring those together for you. And when we were pulling together the 10 trends and really battling out which one makes the cut and which one doesn't, I really wanted to look at it from two lenses. I wanted to look at the traditional lens, I'm going to call it traditional for want of a better word, of looking at some of the most trusted sources that we've got, whether that's the likes of the Gartner, fantastic companies like LinkedIn, Salesforce, HubSpot, who all release fantastic data. So I wanted to look at the trusted sources. But I also wanted to go left of field, and it might seem left of field, but there's actually very valid reasons as to why. So I started to look at what influence does Taylor Swift have on the world, other than the fact that half the population are Swifties and buying friendship bracelets. Like beyond that, what impact would that have on a B2B business? What's happening in presidential campaigns? You know, history tells us that the marketing that is done on presidential campaigns actually then falls into the mainstream, for want of a better word, and actually we start to see that play out in business. So these seemingly left field sources actually have a history and proof points and a pattern of then showing up in business. So I kind of wanted my cake and eat it, and I wanted to pull together the best of the best. So that is what this is about, is really combining those two worlds and those two forces to come up with my top 10. So with that, let's make a start and start with our number one. So number one for me is the influence of the creator economy. So a few years ago, I don't really know that anyone was talking much about the creator economy and certainly not how it would impact B2B. Now, what's interesting here is what I'm seeing is this bit of a paradox. On the one hand, digital trust is at an all-time low. If we also look at trust of sellers and the sales profession is also incredibly low. Some of the stats I've read is in the region of 3%. It's extremely low. So digital trust is going down. However, we all know trust is hugely influential in terms of how B2B buyers make their decision-making. So where does the trust sit? What's interesting is we're actually starting to look more at individuals, at people. So Time magazine came out with the top 100 creators and named the likes of Mel Robbins, Stephen Bartlett, some of those fantastic creators. And they're doing so through their content, their podcast, their media that they're bringing out to the world. Now, what I'm seeing is there is a massive, massive opportunity for B2B to take a leaf out of their book. Because what we're seeing now is content that is shared by individuals rather than a brand. It's likely to go 7 times further at least. And some stats I saw recently were up to 20 times more power. And so therefore, I think the opportunity for us is who are the individuals behind our brand that we can actually bring forward a little bit, and not just the CEO or the leadership, but have you got some engineers that we could have on a podcast? Have you got a pre-sales person that we could interview for a blog? How are your sellers appearing? An interesting one for me is I do a lot with LinkedIn. And one of their sellers who I work with He recently came and joined me on stage speaking at a conference. He's a seller and he was, as an individual contributor, on stage with me speaking at a conference. And that was partially helping him drive some pipeline and some opportunity. He's a guest expert on our Rev Up program. And so what I think is interesting about that is, if I go back to my time in corporate sales, I was not required to do any of those things. And I think now this comes back to my favorite topic of it blurs the line of sales and marketing, because whose responsibility is it to be the face? Whose responsibility is that to initiate it? It gets very, very blurry. And so I think the opportunity here is how can we actually amplify some of our people? And you can see from an example here, Deloitte got on this bandwagon. So Deloitte named their first corporate influencer. I don't really love the term corporate influencer. I think if anyone can come up with a better term, message me. I'd love to come up with a better term for it. But the punchline and the point is there. And so I think that is a massive, massive, massive opportunity for all of us. I think that not many people are doing it well. And I think that a lot of people are uncomfortable with it. And I get that. I do not feel particularly comfortable with half of what I post on LinkedIn. It feels very awkward putting your face out on a podcast and, so on. But I think there is huge opportunity for those who are prepared to get uncomfortable. And so if I follow through that bouncing ball and go, why is that also important? It's not only about trust and brand and who we're following as individuals, but it's also now how are we searching and buying? And even in the world of B2B, a lot of us are going and searching using ChatGPT, Gemini, Perplexity. Depending on which data point you want to follow, the B2B buyer is 60 to 70% of the way through their decision-making journey before they've even reached out to your seller. Your seller, your sales team, yes, they can have fantastic relationships, but often it's the back part of the sales cycle. The first part of the sales cycle is digital, and the shift that's starting to come in is some of the AI search. The latest data point I got from Neil Patel was about 15% of our search is through these LLMs. The rest of it is still the other sort of traditional ways of doing so, but it's rising really fast. And this was an interesting one for me. I get that it's a small business example, but I was looking for some new software and a new membership platform. Simply went into the LLMs and said, hey, can you compare these different platforms? Can you scorecard them? Can you rank them? A lot of stuff I do now is, can you look at online sentiment? What are people saying online? Now, each of these LLMs pulls their information differently, and that's a topic for another day and something I talk about in a lot of my materials and will share in the follow-up resources. But the punchline is they are gathering information from blogs. They're gathering it from YouTube. They're gathering it from long form content. They're gathering it from all these places. So I think the more that we can actually have the voices, the people, the faces behind our business, actually coming to the forefront, not only is it going to help build that trust, not only is it going to be a powerhouse move that cuts through above the noise and stands out in a noisy market, but it's also going to start to feed the LLMs, which is now how buyers are starting to refine and search. And even in high-end enterprise, where we're talking about $1 million plus deals, people are still coming back to the LLMs to do some of their homework, educating, learning, to shortlist the suppliers that they're going to reach out to. So every single way I skin this cat, I think there's an amazing opportunity to start to lean in. And the particular reason I like to lean in is I also look at what are most people not prepared to do. Most people are not prepared to get on a podcast. They're not prepared to get on a stage and speak. Obviously, I'm speaking to the masses here. A lot of people even say to me, I don't want to post on LinkedIn. I feel uncomfortable posting on LinkedIn. So therefore, I think there's an opportunity to go where others won't. Recent stat I saw on this is only 1% of LinkedIn users post weekly. Might feel like it's busy and noisy, but in reality, the minority are actually doing it weekly and consistently. So there's an opportunity there. So if I peel back a couple little first steps that we can take on this, what is one way that you could elevate the voices of your team in 2026? What would it look like if it was easy? I love changing it around, going, okay, I know that if I go to these people, they're going to resist, but what could we actually do to kickstart this to make it easy? Who would be those voices? And not just sales, but across the business. And obviously doing so within the guardrails of your brand guidelines and what we want people saying online. We don't want people just posting on LinkedIn and actually brand damaging behavior, but within the guardrails, who can we elevate? Who can we put forward? My unconventional question, I really like journaling and asking questions like this when I'm doing my 2026 planning, because I feel like I often come to a better answer and challenge my thinking more. So congratulations, you've got a new team member. Stephen Bartlett is your now CEO. What would he do? How would he make this move? And I think this is a really interesting reflection point to go, how can you start to take the first steps on that journey? So I'll give you 2 seconds, just pop any notes that you've got on trend number one. All right, so trend number two, moving on. Trend number two is looking at the evolution that we've got right now around talent that is needed and the skills that are needed. It is really interesting to know that, I think most of us have seen the data point that by 2030, 70% of the skills that we need to do our job is going to have changed. I quite like looking at what are the constants. This is the one I stole from a Jeff Bezos book of, okay, we know certain things are always going to change, but what are the constants that are going to stay the same? So Jeff Bezos knew for Amazon, people are always going to want a fast delivery. No one's going to go, slow it down, please. Please bring my parcel slower. People are always going to want an exceptional customer experience. So the bets that he made are what we know people are going to want. If I take that and I translate that to what skills do we believe sales and go-to-market teams need, and they're not going to change. AI, we already know the high performance sales and go-to-market teams are using AI. It is here. It is well and truly on its way. So skills like that, I think, are the ones we need to start leaning on and betting on. And they're the ones that historically we haven't needed. And in many cases, there's a skill gap there. This level of adaptability and so on, I think, is really interesting. If you were to have shadowed me in my job 2 years ago, you would have seen that the majority of the time I was actually talking about sales, go-to-market, growth. That was what I talked about all day, every day. If you followed me around now, I would argue 50% of the time I'm now talking about how do we get our teams to adapt? How do we get them to embrace change? How do we get them to have that resilience when there's the constant change? How do they execute amongst the noise? How do they manage this and still be able to generate leads, deliver growth, execute amongst the noise? And so I think it's become very, very relevant skill that we're having to have. There's a Gartner data point. It's not on this chart, but it's in the full PDF that you'll get, that adaptive by design organizations have 3.3 times more commercial success. And I think that, again, that's not historically, if you were to look at a sales enablement or a revenue enablement program 2-3 years ago, maybe I'm being biased in this, but I don't think many people had on the agenda, let's lean into the skills of how do we build an adaptive organization and help our team with that. And I think it's something that we need to be able to do. We've talked about or started to touch on some of that digital buyer journey, how the buyer journey is starting to change, and we'll dive into that one a little bit more. And there's different skills we're having to have there. We know that as humans, some of the human skills that we have are actually starting to rise. There's been a 70% increase in demand for relationship-based skills in the past year, because ironically, the more AI and automation that we've got, the more will you just give me a real human. And what are we really good at as humans? Storytelling, building relationships, empathy, rapport. Some of those sorts of skills are actually starting to now rise in their demand, so that we're really putting the humans at where the humans are best. And then finally, cross-functional collaboration. We're going to talk about the customer journey in a little bit, but ultimately this blurred world that we've started to touch on of digital, in-person, and changing customer buyer behavior and profile is requiring us that we can't have the leaky funnel anymore between sales and marketing. So we'll pick up on that a little bit more as we go through, but to sort of kickstart it with some of the top 5 skills that we found and needed for 2026, this is kind of our starting point that we're needing to make sure, where do your team rank on this? Which skills do you think they're really strong on? Which skills do you think they probably need to lean into a little bit more? And when I'm actually doing this in practice, I always like to make things really, really highly practical. The starting point for me is actually this. Anyone who's worked with me, I've got a couple of familiar faces on the line. I always start with this. I love Adam Grant's work, the organizational psychologist, who talks about intelligence traditionally was viewed as the ability to think and learn. But now in a more turbulent world, is it actually a different set of cognitive skills that matter more? Our ability to rethink and unlearn. And I love at this time of year asking that question. What do we need to rethink and unlearn? When we think about our strategy for 2026, when we think about on this point of number 2, the skills that we need in 2026, what do we need our team to rethink and unlearn to put ourselves in the best possible position to move forward? And I think that's a really, really, really powerful reframe that all of us are having to do and navigate. And so my questions for skill number 2 is, what skills won't change like we talked on? And if your team were to develop one of those skills, start with one, because there's several there that we've touched on, what one would have the biggest impact? What for you would be a lead domino that if we did this one, it would make everything else a little bit easier or relevant. What one skill do you need to lean into first? And I'm also really curious about this around, I like looking at how does sports team, how do athletes, how do they train, how do they learn, how do they develop skills? And it's quite interesting to look at that. If you look at athletes, typically, they don't just go, well, these are our skill gaps. They actually go, well, I'm really, really strong on this. A tennis player who's really strong on their forehand, that's my strength, that's my superpower. They also look at, well, how do I keep practicing that so that I can lean into it? I feel like traditionally, when we've looked at skills for teams, we've talked about, well, where just are the gaps? Where are we missing? Rather than also going, well, how do we also hone our superpower, our strength that is giving us a competitive advantage? So I like to think of it from both lenses. What do we need to kind of up level? But what also is the superpower that we don't want to lose along the way? So how would an Olympic coach train your team? The other lens I think is really interesting, I talked about this on my newsletter today, around looking at the world of sports and so on, is they also prioritize recovery. I was reading a Serena Williams quote the other day that said that actually the professional athletes prioritize recovery. It's the amateurs who don't prioritize recovery. If we go back to the previous point on skills, dealing with that amount of change, there is a massive volume of change fatigue. There is a massive volume of burnout. There's a massive challenge with the pace right now that is really causing huge cost to businesses in terms of burnout, silent quitting, overwhelm, fatigue, all the rest of it. And it's really interesting that if you look at the world of sport, coaches actually also go, how do we have those micro breaks? How do we just had Dr. Christy Goodwin on one of our private Rev Up intakes. And she talked about that. How do you prioritize also recovery? And I get as businesses, most of the time we don't stop, but how do we actually, have those little micro moments so that we can actually keep sustaining this pace as we're moving forward? As many people are saying, the pace right now is the slowest that it's ever going to be. It's only going one way, and that is faster. So how do we create those pauses to make sure that our team are actually be able to sustain that as we go into 2026? So hopefully that gives you a couple ideas for number 2 and some of the skills you might want to develop. All right, so moving to number 3. So number 3 is the changing buyer journey that we are starting to experience. The buyer journey, I loved it when the buyer journey was just presented as this really nice linear, someone finds out about us, they make an inquiry, we have a meeting, we do a proposal, they then make a decision. Like, it was so nice, it was so easy, like those were the days. And I really loved that. And now it just doesn't seem to exist anymore. We now have got a completely different buyer journey, which I'm going to show you a diagram of in a moment. But before I do, the key takeaways are we're now thinking more in loops. And you'll hear a lot of people talking about loop marketing and the buyer journey looping. And what do they mean by looping? For me, I actually take it in a couple different ways. One way that I take it is we're obviously now looking at, we don't want it to be cool, they buy from us, done, that's it. We want people to be able to actually continue on the journey and look at the cross-sell and the upsell and like the retention and the lifetime value of that client. So we'll often talk about the loop in that scenario. But in another way, loops, it's also in terms of the complexity. There are more decision makers in B2B involved than ever before. There's the more stakeholders, there's more delays, there's more complexity. There's also a changing profile. Most B2B buyers now are millennials and Gen Zs who are digital natives, who are starting online first. As I said before, they're nearly 70% of the way through their decision-making journey before they even reach out to you. And so how we start to influence and engage with those buyers is starting to be in a more digital manner. So what we're finding when we're working now on projects is we're having to now look and measure completely different things that a couple of years ago we were not measuring. A couple of years ago, we weren't looking at as sophisticatedly, or I didn't have the technology to do as sophisticatedly, intent signals and using them to look at buyer behavior, to look at lead scoring and where can sellers prioritize their time, to look at sales intelligence tools and prioritizing our time. All of this sort of stuff has changed, and we're now having to look at things like intent data, sales intelligence to see signals of life, but signals also of high intent, and therefore where the sales team should be prioritizing their time so they're focusing on those opportunities with the greatest potential. So with that, this is the Gartner diagram of the buyer journey at this point. Now, honestly, I just have no words for this. I'm trying not to swear, but it's a cluster. Let's go with cluster, and I'll just remove the second part of that word. It is so complex. It is so stop, start, get somebody else involved, go get another colleague to sign off. So many stakeholders. It's so complex. And that is why, amongst all this journey that loops, goes round, is complex, and is not linear anymore, that is why things like intent signals, that sales intelligence, having our best friend AI to help us, is actually starting to become more important now so that we prioritize our attention in the right area, as I mentioned before. And that's why it's becoming so important. And of course, our good friend ghosting. I'm sure everyone loves a good ghosting when you work really hard on a proposal and they go quiet and disappear. Again, intent signals are helping us to be able to prioritize. And so that's where we're seeing a bit of a shift in obviously who the B2B buyer typically is, how they are behaving, and the journey that they're having to go through. Now, the good news about all of this that I love is this is where I do think AI has a role. I think AI is helping us to navigate some of this complexity in a fraction of the time and at a fraction of the expense. We use a lot of AI tools in this, and we're a small business, and they're pretty, they're not cost prohibitive anymore. They're pretty accessible to all. And I think that's where some of this, we know that sales is now augmented as a profession between AI and humans. And I think that's where there's parts in this to be able to help us navigate this journey and then look at the right point, the right stage, the right form of communication for us humans to step in and take over. So with that, on trend number 3, what is the most pressing gap that you see in your digital journey that you could improve for 2026? And I also like asking questions like this because when you ask most people about it, it's a beast. It's a huge project. It's a huge beast that's going to take time. We actually don't really have time because it's moving so fast. And so I like asking myself challenging questions like, if you had to achieve your 2-year goal in 6 months, what would you do? Now, you might not achieve the 6 months, but maybe you'll achieve the 12 months. And I think it's really, really, really interesting to sort of start to force a little bit of priority there over where do you need to actually improve the most on that navigating that new framework of the buyer journey. So that is our trend number 3. Moving on to our trend number 4. Client experience as a proven growth strategy. I don't know whether any of you saw this, but HubSpot released a really fantastic report recently, and they interviewed a huge proportion, I'll get the stats for you, but a huge proportion of growth leaders, revenue leaders, and asked them about their top growth strategy. And client experience came as number 1. And I would say a few years ago, and maybe I'm biased in this, but a few years ago, I think sometimes client experience could get put in the nice to have bucket and a bit fluffy bucket. And I think it's really nice and positive to see actually how much so this is actually being brought to the top and front and center. We know that buyers now are more demanding than ever. Salesforce did a study and they found across 5,500 sellers, when asking them, what is your number 1 challenge? The number 1 challenge that they said is increasingly demanding customers. We have off the charts expectations. We want real time. We want it now. We want self-serve. We want it personalized. We want all those things, and all of that is feeding into client experience. We are starting to see now the client experience officer, the chief customer officer, those sorts of roles to really amplify now how this is being done. And I think it's really important in this as well, starting to look at where does AI play a part in that experience and where does it actually go to a real human being. I had a really interesting experience at an airport recently. I was trying to get help. And I was at the customer service desk trying to get help, and they told me that I had to go and speak to the phone the call center. I'm like, but I'm in person at your customer service desk. Are you kidding me? And they're like, no, you got a phone, and they wouldn't help me, and that's infuriating. And so I think that trade-off of where does AI play a part, and it's a positive AI experience versus where do we actually need the human experience. And as I said, relationship-based skills and the demand for that is actually increasing. It's ironic how sort of old becomes new and it becomes full circle. And I want to give a really good example of this that I use really regularly, because sometimes we think of client experience, it's so big, it's such a beast, it's so complex, there's so many 1%ers that make that up. And it doesn't always have to be technology, it doesn't always have to be AI, it can be the simple things. In the US, there was a study done at a hospital, and they looked at doing like fresh paint and fresh aesthetics and, improving the environment. They looked at technology, they looked at all these things. Nothing was improving, in this instance, the patient experience. And then they got the nurses as they were leaving the room to say, hey, done the rounds, as finishing the rounds. Is there anything else I can do for you? I've got time. Those 3 words, I've got time, sent their customer experience and their patient satisfaction records through the roof. Now, those nurses probably had gritted teeth and were like, I don't have time. Like, I don't think anyone's ever seen a nurse who's chilling out. They do not have time. But it was the perception. And so I'm curious around how do we even do those one percenters in our business and make it easy? That doesn't need approval. That doesn't need technology. That doesn't cost anything. It's free to be able to actually just go, hey, at the end of every client meeting, can we just check in? You know, is there anything else we can be doing to support you better? We've got time. But in a meaningful way. And I think that's just one example of, you know, how do you do the one percenters? How do the team do things? Another great example of this, one of our suppliers that we work with is an IT company who does our IT. And he said his goal is whenever he goes on site and he does a lot of like physical location work, and he will go on site and he says, my goal and my team's goal is they have to fix one thing. They have to find one thing, one way they can add value so that every time it's like they come to visit, they are known for, cool, they contribute, they add value. And they're not charging for it, looking for extra chargeable work. It's like, hey, whilst I was here, I also just did ABC because I thought whilst I was here, I'll just, you know, sort that out for you. And so it's not about like finding the extra work. It's just going to say a really quick, easy win that would actually constantly over deliver, surprise and delight. Any data points you look about customer experience, a lot of the time it's actually not just consistently good experience, it's actually those peaks, that surprise, that elevation that got the incredible result. So thinking about how do you put this into action, I like looking at this from two lenses. I like thinking, what is one way that I can elevate the client experience for the client? If we were to streamline something or improve something or speed something up, what's one way it would actually improve the client experience their side that they would see? And then what's one way I could do it that actually reduce my friction internally and would speed it up for us, which would also, you know, go full circle and give the wins externally. My unconventional question, if Walt Disney was suddenly consulting, we brought Walt Disney back, he was consulting on your client experience, what would he recommend? You know, Walt Disney famously, when he started theme parks were known for being quite dirty. It was being known to be a bit like, you know, the old school circus. It was like not a very nice, pleasant experience. It was sort of pretty dirty and a lot of rubbish. He gave people, as they entered the Walt Disney parks, sweets and with wrappers. And then they monitored how quickly, how many meters would it be before they dropped a wrapper and it would create litter. And that's where they needed to locate the bins. That was the level they put into thinking about their client experience. So every touch point in Walt Disney is about the experience. I actually ironically had Disney as a customer when I was in IT, and we were called the data centers backstage. And then anything that everyone could see was front of house, like was on stage. So it was on stage, backstage. I've never honestly done an IT tender talking about backstage rather than data center. It was a whole new vocabulary for me, but they were committed right the way through. Everything was part of the show. So look, I'm not suggesting you need to go hire Mickey Mouse, but what would be a one percenter that you could do to improve the client experience? And like I said, it doesn't always have to be big to have a big impact. All right, number 5 on our journey. I am pretty obsessed with this one right now. I was having a really great conversation about it last night with someone who's actually on. Community-led growth is pretty interesting to watch. So over the past few weeks, some of you might have seen, Taylor Swift announced her album launches, and she didn't just do it in any old way. Of course, she did it in Taylor Swift way of hiring out cinemas and all of the Swifties flocking to cinemas to go watch and see the new album. She brought together her community in person and created that connection. Diary of a CEO did the same. When they were releasing some major episodes with some big hitters, they got all the Diary of a CEO community together to do screenings and everyone watching as the episode was released together. What's interesting about that is I think it's a new, different way to go about community and how we bring people together. Again, old school is now new school. Bringing people back together in person is being said to be one of the best, moats that you could put around your business in a time where it's going to be very competitive. How do we create stickiness, loyalty through that community and protect from competition? You look at things like memberships. People say they join for the knowledge that they might want to gain on a certain course, but they stay and they stick around, they continue paying because of actually some of the community that they build. So I think for B2B businesses, I think it's interesting to kind of go, how do we bring some of that back? But also, how do we reinvent it? Now, I'm not suggesting you need to go hire out a cinema, but is there new, interesting, novel ways you could bring together your partner ecosystem? I've got a call this morning with an IT vendor where we're looking at bringing together a huge group of partners. We're all looking at going away together for a few days, but we're doing like the modern take on what would have been a sales academy to make it actually fun, and it's an experience and it's a way, and it's going to create that sort of desirability about it. So what is a new, interesting way you could bring people together in 2026? And coupled with that, if you had Taylor Swift, I'm not sure any of us can afford her, but let's pretend. How would Taylor Swift bring together your clients in new, unique ways that you haven't even thought of? I actually think that is where it's going to be at. And like I said, most of the thought leaders, I geek out like you would not believe, reading, podcasting, everything. If you follow any of my stuff, you'll know that I'm consuming like nobody's business. And this is a consistent one for me, that no matter which thought leader I look at, they're all calling it that this is kind of the place to be. And I think for me, it's just about reinventing how we do it that keeps it interesting and exciting, that people want to go. I'm not going to drive into the city and leave home and do all of that if it's actually not something that's going to be super, super compelling for me. And so that's the opportunity for number 5. How do we really lean into that community-led growth as a great way of creating an experience for whether it's our partners, our customers, our strategic partners, our resellers, whoever that might be that really sits in your community. So that is our number 5 on the list. All right, number 6. Revenue orchestration. Anyone who has heard me speak before will know this is my soapbox moment. I kind of apologize, kind of don't apologize for it. Creating the alignment between revenue generating teams now has to be essential. We've barked on about it for a very, very long time. And I think people are aware of it. Statistically speaking, only 8% of companies have a strong alignment between their sales and marketing, and those that do generate 209% more revenue. It's been the age-old problem forever. But I think for revenue leaders, this has now become really, really high up the priority list to fix because of everything we talked about. Talking about, bringing together community, is that sales or is that marketing? Talking about that creator economy and putting forward the faces of your business on the digital part of the journey. Is that sales or is that marketing? Digital sales and the first digital sales part of the journey where people don't want to engage with a seller. Is that sales or marketing? It's seriously great. And so aligning them is actually now just a non-negotiable. There was some research out of LinkedIn, which I would still consider to be very true, that 9 out of 10 sales and marketing and go-to-market teams feel like they're misaligned on strategy, KPIs, communication, and so on. I see this every single day of the week, and I think it's a huge missed opportunity. LinkedIn also, if you look to the right-hand side of your screen, LinkedIn also did a study of looking at how are marketing using LinkedIn and how are sales using LinkedIn. And they found that over 75% of the time, they were targeting different audiences. On most briefing calls that I speak to, I get from marketing tell us the opportunities over here and sales tell us the opportunities over there. They are completely misaligned, even on who are we targeting and where is the biggest opportunity. So coming back, regrouping for 2026, honestly has to be that solid foundation. Otherwise, we just have one hell of a leaky funnel. We are losing an enormous amount of our marketing budget, and it really is spinning our tires in a wasted direction. So we know this, but how do we fix it? For me, interestingly, I see this repair start to actually happen quite quickly. And it starts to just happen very simply with the consistency of communication. So can you have a fortnightly huddle that's a go-to-market huddle? Some of our clients, because I love the word smarketing, which HubSpot coined, and I wish they hadn't because I love the word. I thought I was really clever and came up with it, but HubSpot beat me to it, damn it. But on that note, can you have a fortnightly smarketing meeting and bring them together? And we've seen massive, massive gains just from that. Can I get my sales, marketing, go-to-market, whoever else is relevant leaders together once a fortnight to create a huddle? What is the rhythm? What's the agenda? What does that look like so it's meaningful and not just another meeting in your diary? Because I don't think any of you are looking just for extra meetings to fill up your day. But how can we actually do that to create that alignment? Where are you seeing opportunity? Where are you seeing opportunity? We actually typically start with a survey that's really basic, and it immediately creates alignment in less than 10 questions. And we're simply asking, where are you seeing opportunity? Where are you winning? Where are you losing? Where are your challenges? What skills do you think you need to develop? all different questions like that, and starting to align. What questions are you getting asked the most often? It's the Julie Masters special. What's in your question bank? Simply aligning on those few questions actually really starts to immediately make sure we're focusing and we're running the same race and not in different directions. So on this, my unconventional question is, if you had a football coach who is leading your team, how would they align your revenue generating team? Now, I'm pretending here, I should actually say soccer given we're in Australia, but I'm pretending here because I coached my 6-year-old soccer team. So therefore that makes me completely qualified as a coach. But if you've got, your defenders have got one job, your strikers have got another job, midfield have got another job. Everyone's got a different job, just like sales, marketing, product, go to market and technical. They've all got different jobs, but they all have to be orchestrated together by that conductor to be able to actually be aligned, that we're all playing the same game and we're on the same page here. And so how could you create that alignment between the different functions and the different roles, whether you're attacking, you're defending, how could you pull them together? You can probably see from that I was not a very good soccer coach for my 6-year-old's team, but I tried. I was embracing change, I was adapting, and I was trying to build a new skill. So that's all I got. I'm going to stick to sales for the rest of this because football coaching is limited, but there you go. So on this, my big question though, on a serious note, is how do you try and drive that revenue orchestration? How do you kill the beast that has been a long-standing issue that really needs nipped in the bud once and for all? So with that, moving into trend number 7. Trend number 7 is all around our tech enablement. We have talked already about the fact that, sales is now an augmented profession of humans and AI. I went to South by Southwest Sydney recently, and on the right-hand side, what you're looking at is an org chart that got presented by someone of this is the new org chart that we are seeing in organizations. Now, I'm not sure how well you can read that, but the punchline is you got humans at the top, and then beneath it, they're fictional characters. So we got Darth Vader, Chewie, and so on. You can tell we've got a bit of a Star Wars theme going on here. They all had their roles as AI agents, whether it was a paid ad specialist, whether it was a content manager, whether it was a copywriter, and so on. There are unbelievable announcements starting to also happen in the world of sales around what we are starting to see around AI tools that can support us in sales. When I started my sales career, I went to IBM's sales school for 2 years. It's kind of like Harry Potter's Hogwarts, but for sellers. And the research that we were taught to do would take us, honestly, several hours. You can now do that in a fraction of a second. And so, what's being said here is ultimately we are the last generation who would have ever experienced being solely the managers of people and not having an org chart like this that is managers of AI agents and people. We are the last generation, which is quite scary to say. Now, on this journey, what I'm noticing and observing in my work, which is why I sort of framed it at the start, is I'm noticing that a lot of us are getting tools technology, which is super cool, but we're not getting enabled properly how to do it, or it's not being embedded properly. Now, this is just my lens, but any of the data points that you look at do back up that most sellers feel overwhelmed by the number of tools and technology that they have to use. I think it's safe to say that most sellers don't use their CRMs to its full capability. And I think there's so much there left on the table. It's like having a Ferrari that's locked in the garage. And so I think we are having to finally look at how do we actually have that tech enablement to make sure that where we need humans, we've got humans, where we need AI agents, we've got AI agents. The average seller is spending less than 30% of their time selling. So how are we increasing that time selling by getting AI to do some of the legwork for them that they then validate? But teaching them how to do it. You can see here sales and go-to-market teams are having to juggle over 13 tools. That's enormous. We found in our team, we were all using AI very, very differently. And we had to really go, hang on a sec, we're all using it differently and badly. So what enablement are we actually having to make sure that we're using it well? For me, I think that I'm seeing a massive tech sprawl and overwhelm. And I think there's a lot of people are starting to simplify that, but go deeper into getting the most out of the tools that they've got. That's kind of my lens of what I'm seeing on this. So where I typically start with this is looking at what's your one repeat offender. If you had one repeat offender that is taking you away from time with clients, time with relationships, time as a leader with what you're doing best, how could you actually go through that process and look at where there would be a good AI use case? I find that when we start to look at an entire buyer journey, it becomes bloody overwhelming for most people. Whereas I find when we start looking at one use case or one task, it becomes actually much easier. Give you a personal example. In my business a couple of weeks ago, we found the podcast, our new podcast. Hopefully you're listening to it. Our new podcast was just overwhelming our team. It was just becoming this beast that it wasn't intended to be. So we literally went, okay, we're going to streamline. We looked at it and there's 16 steps involved in our podcast. So we then went through, how do we put that into an AI workflow and then still have the human factor to give it the human edge and the polish and everything that it needs. But in one click of a button now, we can do 16 steps. And the tool that we ended up selecting, because we looked at, do we build it ourselves or do we select a tool? We found a tool on market. I think, don't quote me on this, it costs us something like $100 US a month, something like that. And so that was picking one use case and the biggest beast and the biggest repeat offender. That's what I mean by repeat offender, not the people who are peeving you off. That's a different repeat offender list. But we found one use case. In sales, we've worked through that before to go, what is it? Is it some of our clients that we've done some consultancy work on? It's actually being meeting prep. Hey, it's taken on average our sellers 30 minutes to prep for a meeting. They're tasked to do, I don't know, let's take an example, 5 meetings a day. Hang on, that's a lot of hours suddenly. We're doing 2.5 hours of meeting prep. So what is the one use case? The other one we had in our business was proposals. Proposals were taking too long, which if I come back to my earlier question, how do I make it better for the client, easier for me? It was too slow to get proposals out, which just cannot happen. So we had to streamline it to make it a better experience for them, that they got their proposal quickly, and an easier experience for us, that it wasn't such a beast. So what's one use case? My sort of secret hint on this is I'm finding often it's the basics. It's researching the prospect, helping me prepare for that meeting. It's a lot of those basics. Another one that I love is I was prepping for a meeting and I turned all the information that I had into a podcast. I then got in the car and I listened to the podcast on the way to the meeting to be able to really drill into my memory all of that stuff that I wanted to remember. Devil's advocate, looking at the question a different way. If your team had to still hit their quota, still do what they're doing, but I'm going to remove your licenses to half of the tools that you're playing with. So as we were just looking at, there was 13 tools daily. I'm going to remove 6 in a bit. Which ones would they complain about and which ones would they fight to keep? I think it's a really interesting perspective to then go on which ones we actually just not maximizing. And hey, if they're not fighting to keep them, it's not always that the tool isn't any good. It's actually sometimes we haven't invested in the enablement and the training to actually use the Ferrari to its full potential. And I often find things change. I'm guilty of this. I went into the back end of our CRM a couple of days ago and I went, whoa, there's all this new functionality I didn't even know was there. Where did that come from? Hang on, what's that doing? How can that help us? So I think it's changing so fast that it's that constant movement rather than, once a year and we're done, tick. I would say enablement as a whole has become that continuous learning experience and not a one-hit wonder. It's almost like the micro just-in-time learning consistently, constantly as we go, rather than once a year is just not enough. So that's our trend number 7. And I'll leave you for 2 seconds to make a note on that. So trend number 8. Number 8 is around the prospecting journey. Now, honestly, I could do a full day workshop on this. So this is my attempt to do it in a couple minutes. We know now where it's at with prospecting and has been for a while is this element of deep sales, which is a term that LinkedIn really came out with. Shallow sales is spray and pray, modern day version of picking up the phone book and smiling and dialing and having the same outreach and the same conversation with everyone, no level of personalization. I had a brilliant LinkedIn message on this the other day. The person for LinkedIn messaged me, I should screenshot it, and it was like, hi, first name, do you want to come to our event, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, come on. It is brand damaging. And I actually look at a lot of outreach right now that I see, and I would categorize it as brand damaging. And I think a lot of companies need to reset on how we are currently outreaching. Is that a reflection of our brand that we want? I interviewed Kat Warboys on our podcast a while ago. It's a great episode, worth revisiting. And she talked about the fact 1/3 of customers, so it was a HubSpot stat, 1/3 of customers are prepared to walk away from a brand that they love because they feel like they're being spammed. Would your clients be prepared to walk away from you because they feel like they're being spammed? Or actually, are we outreaching and adding value? I love Julie Masters, who's a thought leader around influence and one of our REV UP experts. She talks about this of, I can outshout, I can outspend on ads and stuff, or I can out-contribute. And my personal take is I'm kind of with Julie in this camp of how do I out-contribute? And that's sort of really been a huge goal of mine. And I think in prospecting right now, I am seeing that the more personalized and tailored and targeted and out contributing that I go, the best success that I'm having. The highest performing sellers are outreaching less than underperformers, but they are going the extra mile and going deeper every single time. And that level of personalization is having to be at the three layers. Do I know the individual, the stakeholder? What's important to them? Obviously, now where there's so many stakeholders involved and we're having to multi-thread, are we actually really understanding the different, often conflicting priorities of each stakeholder and therefore how I might personalize depending on who's in the mix? The company, what's important for their company? What are their 2026 goals? What are their 2026 priorities? And what's going on in the industry? Is there regulation change? Is there competitive nature happening? What's going on and how do I personalize? So I think this level of deep sales right now it's been here for a while. I would say the minority of people are actually doing it and doing it well, which again, my job all day, every day to spot the opportunity. You might know this, you might have heard it before, you might have even heard me say it before. I still think it's an opportunity because I would still say the minority are doing it with excellence. So I think the opportunity is leaning into this and doing it with excellence. You will stand out from the crowd in a noisy market in no time. Not many people are going this extra level and extra mile. And this comes full circle back to our previous point, which is, well, you can't do that for everybody. I don't have hours in the day to prospect and tailor to that level for everybody. It's using some of that intent data, signals, sales intelligence, AI that we talked about with the buyer loop to actually prioritize where we should be spending our time. And obviously AI is helping guide us so that we're really focusing where there's the highest propensity and going deeper there. Now, another lens on prospecting that I think is a really awesome opportunity that I want to give you a little bit of a snippet from is really considering around win-loss reviews. And I don't just mean a token tick of the box in the CRM, but really going deeper on why are we winning, why are we losing? Because I think there's a lot of opportunity left on the table. So I interviewed Kian McLaughlin on our new podcast. His episode is honestly, it's nothing short of fantastic. So check it out. And here's a little bit about what Kian says it takes to win and prospect in the current market in complex B2B sales.
Risk has jumped to the top of the food chain by a country mile in terms of the most critical decision criteria. Every single organization we talk to, if it's a meaningful dollar value of an opportunity, it's risk, risk, risk. But the thing that I've learned, which is fascinating, is risk isn't just organizational, it's personal. There's a lot of people who are putting their personal or professional brand on the line or currency on the line if they make a buying decision in your favor. So you've got to find ways to understand, manage, mitigate, share risk with customers that we didn't have to do 3 or 4 years ago. If you're the safest pair of hands in the current environment, you're putting yourself in a really, really strong position to win. And if you can do better discovery, wrap that into win themes and be the safest pair of hands, you're in a really, really good position.
So some interesting points from that. Firstly, check out the episode, but Kian really talks about how are you learning from where we've lost and where we've won, and really looking at going deeper there of what do we need to learn. He gave fantastic examples of interviewing customers of why we lost and then subsequently went on to win them. We do so much work, prospecting, marketing, trying to win, getting the lead, doing the generation, trying to nurture them, going through that whole complex cycle that we saw, doing all the marketing loops, all that stuff, to then only at the end be like, okay, cool, they said no. Or we do a sort of tick box review of like why we won or lost. There's actually missing value and insights in that to be able to actually unpack, okay, cool, how do we feed that back in to the whole way back through the journey? The second part of what you talked to there is around reducing perceived risk. Right now people are nervous, they're cautious. How do we actually reduce the risk? People have been told and sold the dream before. How do we make sure that it's actually, we can really be that we're in this together and in any way possible, we're reducing the perceived risk. So fantastic episode to check out. And I think there's massive value there to be able to be fed back into how we prospect. That again, what I'm trying to pull out here is not necessarily all new things, but things that I don't think many of us lean into with excellence. And I think this is a real opportunity to lean into that many don't. And as Kian says, you get access to your competitor's playbook. So definitely worth checking out. So to kickstart that, could you start small and actually just look at 3 deals that you won, 3 deals that you lost, and how could you run a review of each? Now, I personally find this can be quite hard when it's your own deal. You've got a personal bias. The client was a Muppet, really sophisticated answers like that. could you actually get your colleague? Could you get your peer? Could you get your manager? Could you get somebody else? And it's not about someone checking on you, but someone that a degree of separation that could actually have some of that conversation. And maybe the client would be more willing, depending on the relationship, to have a more free and open discussion about why you won or why you lost. And then I take inspiration again from everywhere in sport. I don't know whether you guys saw this in the Olympics. There was an Olympic athlete, Nicola, who was actually, every time she did a jump, she was doing high jump, every single time she went back and she sat and she got her journal out and she wrote down and she journaled. It wasn't whether it was just a good one or a bad one that she did it every single time, and she journaled and she took it out of her brain and really dumped. How do you actually do that to learn from it? Now, I do this when I speak. After the end of this, I will absolutely be making notes about this worked really, really well. This didn't work so well. Should have had a bigger drink before I started because my throat kept going dry. I'll make all my notes of what worked, what didn't work, so that I actually am constantly learning, tweaking, and refining. Are we having the same discipline in sales? I think sometimes we don't hold ourselves to as high a degree of standard, and therefore that's why I think if the minority are doing it, it's still an edge, it's still an advantage. So, trend number 9, execution. I'm going all in on this topic. I am researching it like you would not believe. I've got a lot of secret projects in the background working on this topic. How do we bridge the gap between the great idea, the great intention, the great strategy, and then the execution that doesn't happen? Number 2, how do we bridge the knowing doing gap? We might train our team and do enablement, and we've said, tick, we've upskilled them, but are they actually doing it? And I think for me, this is where have to start bridging this gap. I lean into methodologies a lot like the 4 disciplines of execution. I lean into ones like traction and EOS to really be able to actually pull out, how do you execute amongst the noise? It's faster and busier and more demanding than ever. So how do you still make it happen? And as I said before, only 30% of the time that sellers have is actually being spent selling. The rest of the time they're lost, and they're not actually focusing where their greatest value can be added and where we need them to be able to execute to be able to achieve the strategy that we've laid out in the business. So in terms of this, I like thinking about this in terms of a pre-mortem. It's a year ahead. 12 months has passed. That's how long you've been on this webinar with me. Thank you. 12 months has passed. It's now December, 12 months and a bit, December 2026. Why did we fail? We've just done a lot of this internally to go, why are we going to win? Why will it work? Or why would it fail? We all know pretty much the repeat offenders of why we're going to fail. What can we then as a pre-mortem do to try and mitigate that? I think, again, when we've talked about the world of sales, go to market, I personally don't believe enough time has actually been focused on, but how do we get our team to actually execute amongst the noise where it's the greatest potential and value that they're going to add? And I think there's a really big skill there that is missing that is going to really help businesses to stream ahead once we lean into this. So then trend number 10. I touched on it a little bit earlier, but energy management and burnout is a revenue risk. This for me, I think, is actually really, really, really big. Firstly, on a personal level, we don't want our teams burnt out, fatigued, off work, loss of productivity, silent quitting, all of the above. And we actually don't want the cost to our business. So as you can see, burnout costs businesses $322 billion annually. I'm going to try and say that for a third time. Do you reckon I can get it? $322 billion annually in lost productivity. And so I think this, again, is something I talked about in my newsletter today because I was reflecting on Dr. Christy Goodwin speaking to some of our Rev Up members. I think that traditionally we focused on, okay, how are you prospecting? What's your emotional intelligence? How are you following up? What's your outreach strategy? I don't think we've often thought about this piece around how we're resetting and how we're managing our energy so that we can actually sustain the marathon that we're being asked to do here. So I think there's a massive opportunity. As I talked about earlier, athletes have a specific strategy to focus on recovery. Recovery is not a nice to have, it's not optional, it's a strategy. So maybe for your team, it might be after a big product release, after a big quarter end, something like that. What is actually our intentional recovery strategy? Some businesses I've seen do it go, right, we're having a meeting-free day. Some people have a well-being day. Others might just go, okay, we're going to have a period where we're actually not going to add anything else in because we're really cognizant we've just come off the back of quarter end. So actually we're going to have sort of a lower productivity rate for a few days where we're going to recover. whatever it might be, right? There's all different strategies of going about this, but I think that it has to be an intentional strategy to be able to sustain the fact we're going into an even faster pace. So that is our 10 that we've sort of pulled together in quite a fast way of doing so. As I mentioned, there's going to be a PDF that comes out with all of the 10, all of the questions, all of the stats. I wanted to leave you with, as I mentioned at the start, a couple free resources, but also just giving you a heads up on what's coming from us as well that supports all of these 10 different emerging trends. I'll come back to that in a sec. The first is REV UP. REV UP is our program that is a professional development pathway for sales and go-to-market teams. We are bringing out some new experts, some new speakers. We've added Kian into the mix, who is coming, who you just saw, and that is going to be starting in February 2026. So if you want to find out a little bit more about that, we're announcing it really soon and coming out with an early bird. You are more than welcome to check that out. The others is on LinkedIn. We are doing every single week, we do a blog with the latest and greatest of what we're seeing. One of my goals, as I mentioned, is to out-contribute. So you will find a huge amount of free resources on podcast, blogs, YouTube, everywhere that you can really access more on these sorts of trends and get stuck into. So I'll flick back, and what I want to finish with is putting this into action as a final sort of closing thought for you. Out of the 10 trends that we've covered, what do you think is the one that you and your team need to rethink, and what do you need to unlearn to be able to do so? And how can you think like a scientist? A scientist has a hypothesis of, if we were to do this, this is what's going to happen. And I'm going to look for the indicators that it's working and the indicators that it's not working. Companies like Diary of a CEO have got a head of failure. You know, if I'd have said head of failure a couple of years ago, you would have laughed at me if I'd said that's my job title. Amazon looked at decisions as, is it a one-way door that we can't come back from, in which case move slow? Is it a two-way door that we can come back from, in which case move fast? The Netflix current subscription model was an experiment to a subset of their database, and they stumbled upon it in an experiment. So out of all the 10 things we've talked about, what could you experiment with for the next 30 days and give it a go? What is a two-way door that is low risk, that you can start having an experiment, think like a scientist and play with, and help you to rethink and unlearn for 2026.
If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to subscribe and follow so that you get our unfiltered conversations every single week.